Before the confetti even finished falling at the Super Bowl, before the halftime reactions flooded social media, before the highlight clips started looping across every sports channel in America, something happened that nobody expected. Bad Bunny had just finished one of the most talked about halftime shows in recent memory. Millions of viewers were still glued to their screens, debating the performance, sharing memes, and replaying the biggest moments. And then Caitlin Clark posted a single sentence. Within minutes, the entire conversation shifted. The halftime show stopped trending. The game itself started fading from the timeline. Suddenly, the internet was asking one question over and over again. What did Caitlin Clark just expose? Because the message wasn't subtle. It wasn't vague. And it definitely wasn't harmless. She wrote only a few words. They didn't want me there. That was it. No explanation. No context. Just a statement that instantly sent fans into detective mode. Sports reporters started refreshing their phones. Analysts paused their Super Bowl coverage. Even people who rarely follow the WNBA suddenly wanted to know what was going on. Who didn't want her there? And why? At first, many assumed she was joking. Maybe it was just a comment about missing the event. But within minutes, insiders began hinting that something much bigger was hiding behind those words. Something involving the Super Bowl. Something involving the WNBA. And something involving a decision that may have been made behind closed doors weeks earlier. Because as more details started leaking out, one thing became clear. Caitlin Clark wasn't just talking about missing the Super Bowl. She was talking about being blocked from it. And if that was true, it raised a question that nobody inside the sports world wanted to answer. Why would anyone stop the biggest rising star in women's basketball from appearing at the biggest sporting event on the planet? What fans didn't know yet was that the story actually started long before the Super Bowl ever kicked off. And once those details began to surface, the situation became a lot more complicated than anyone expected. Weeks before the Super Bowl ever kicked off, conversations were already happening behind the scenes about who would appear during the biggest sports week of the year. Sponsors were organizing celebrity appearances, media segments, and promotional events designed to pull attention from every corner of sports culture. And as those discussions unfolded, one name kept coming up again and again. Caitlin Clark. At that moment, her rise was impossible to ignore. She wasn't just another talented rookie entering professional basketball. She had already become one of the most talked about athletes in the country. Her college career had shattered scoring records. Her highlights were dominating sports media, and every arena she stepped into suddenly sold out. Networks were noticing it. Sponsors were noticing it. Even leagues outside of basketball were noticing it. For brands involved in Super Bowl week, inviting Caitlin Clark made perfect sense. The event isn't just about football anymore. It's about culture. Music, sports, entertainment, and celebrity all collide during that week, and companies want the biggest rising stars present. According to several industry insiders, one major sponsor reportedly pushed her name forward almost immediately during planning discussions. They wanted her sitting courtside at exclusive events, appearing in backstage interviews, and possibly even making a quick appearance during one of the celebrity highlight segments connected to the halftime coverage. From a marketing perspective, it was a dream scenario. The NFL would benefit from connecting with a younger basketball audience. Sponsors would benefit from attaching themselves to the fastest rising athlete in women's sports. And Caitlin Clark herself would gain even more exposure to an audience that might not normally follow the WNBA. Everything seemed lined up perfectly. Initial conversations reportedly went smoothly. Representatives reached out, logistics were discussed, and the idea started moving through the normal approval channels. The kind of routine process that usually happens hundreds of times during Super Bowl planning. But then something strange happened. The invitation stalled. At first, nobody thought much of it. Big events often involve complicated schedules, and approvals sometimes take time. But as days passed, the situation became more confusing. Sponsors who had pushed for her appearance were suddenly being told that the opportunity might not happen after all. The explanation they received was vague. They were told Caitlin Clark was unavailable, which didn't make much sense. She didn't have a game scheduled that weekend. She wasn't traveling with the team. There were no public commitments that would have prevented her from attending. From the outside, it looked like there was absolutely nothing standing in the way. Yet the answer remained the same: unavailable. Eventually, the idea was quietly dropped. The promotional plans moved forward without her name attached, and the Super Bowl continued approaching as usual. To the public, it looked like nothing unusual had happened. After all, nobody expected every athlete to attend the event. But behind the scenes, a few people started asking questions. Because the more they looked into the situation, the stranger it seemed. The NFL hadn't rejected the idea. The sponsor hadn't backed out. And Caitlin Clark herself had never declined the invitation. Somewhere along the approval chain, the opportunity had simply disappeared. At the time, almost nobody outside those conversations knew about it. The story never reached the media. Fans never heard a word about the invitation that never happened. And for weeks, the situation remained buried. Until the night of the Super Bowl, when Caitlin Clark posted that one sentence that sent the entire internet into chaos. Because if she really had been blocked from attending, then someone had made that decision. And the next question became unavoidable. Who? To understand why Caitlin Clark's Super Bowl situation caused such an explosion online, you have to understand what was happening around her long before that night. Because by the time she entered professional basketball, she wasn't just another rookie trying to find her place in the league. She had already become something much bigger. For years, women's basketball had been growing steadily, but Caitlin's arrival pushed that growth into overdrive. During her college run, arenas that normally had empty seats suddenly couldn't sell tickets fast enough. Television ratings started climbing at numbers that shocked even longtime sports analysts. Clips of her deep three-pointers and impossible passes were spreading across social media faster than most professional highlights. People who had never watched a women's basketball game before were suddenly tuning in. Sports talk shows were discussing her nearly every day. Commentators began calling her one of the most exciting players in all of basketball, not just the women's game. Even former NBA stars started mentioning her name during interviews, praising the way she played with confidence and range that reminded fans of some of the greatest shooters the sport had ever seen. And the numbers backed it up. Games featuring Caitlin Clark consistently pulled massive viewership compared to typical broadcasts. Jersey sales skyrocketed. When she played on the road, attendance in opposing arenas doubled or even tripled. Entire fan bases showed up just to watch her warm up. In other words, she wasn't just a talented player. She had become a cultural moment. Sponsors love moments like that. Media companies chase them. And leagues usually celebrate them because a superstar can bring attention that benefits everyone involved. But sometimes, explosive popularity also creates uncomfortable questions behind the scenes. Especially when one athlete begins to overshadow the brand itself. Inside professional sports leagues, there's always a delicate balance between promoting individual stars and protecting the image of the league as a whole. Executives want recognizable players because they draw viewers, but they also want to make sure the spotlight doesn't become too focused on one person. For decades, leagues across sports have tried to maintain that balance carefully. But Caitlin Clark's rise happened so quickly that it disrupted that balance almost overnight. Suddenly, headlines about the WNBA were dominated by her name. Fans who had never followed the league were buying tickets specifically to see her play. Social media clips featuring her highlights were pulling millions of views, while other games struggled to generate even a fraction of that attention. Some analysts celebrated this as a breakthrough moment for women's basketball. Others quietly wondered what it meant for the league's internal dynamics. Because whenever a new star rises that fast, comparisons begin immediately. Veteran players who had spent years building the league's reputation suddenly found themselves sharing headlines with a newcomer who hadn't even played a full professional season yet. The media loved the story. But inside the league offices, some executives were reportedly asking difficult questions. What happens when one player becomes bigger than the league itself? What happens if sponsors begin requesting that player specifically instead of promoting the sport as a whole? And what happens if outside organizations, like the NFL, global brands, or major media companies, start building marketing campaigns around that single athlete? Those questions weren't necessarily about jealousy or hostility. In many cases, they were simply about control. Leagues spend decades carefully managing their public image, their partnerships, and the way their athletes are promoted. When someone rises as quickly as Caitlin Clark did, that control can start to slip. And according to people familiar with internal discussions at the time, some decision-makers were becoming increasingly concerned about exactly that. They worried that if Caitlin's visibility kept expanding at the same pace, the entire narrative around the league might shift toward one superstar instead of the broader roster of athletes. To them, the issue wasn't talent. It was scale. Because Caitlin Clark wasn't just becoming popular within basketball circles. She was becoming a mainstream star. And that kind of visibility can create opportunities far beyond the league itself. Opportunities like appearing at the Super Bowl. Which is exactly why the invitation that quietly disappeared weeks earlier suddenly started looking much more significant. If someone truly decided to block that appearance, the reason might not have been scheduling or logistics. It might have been something far more complicated. And that possibility is exactly what began to surface once the first leaked message appeared online. For a while, the Super Bowl situation remained a quiet mystery. The invitation had disappeared, the event came and went, and most fans had no idea any of it had even happened. But the moment Caitlin Clark posted that message online, the entire sports world started digging. Reporters began calling sources. Fans searched for clues. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, a screenshot started circulating that completely changed the tone of the conversation. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. At first glance it looked like a boring internal message that nobody outside a league office would normally care about. But the wording inside that message immediately caught people's attention. The line that stood out was simple. Elevating one individual athlete too aggressively could risk overshadowing the league's collective brand. That sentence alone might not have meant much if it had appeared on its own. Professional leagues talk about branding strategy all the time. But the timing of the message made people suspicious. The discussion appeared to be connected to outside appearances and marketing opportunities, exactly the kind of situation that would apply to something like the Super Bowl. Once the screenshot began spreading across social media, fans started interpreting the language in a much harsher way. To them, the message didn't sound like routine marketing talk. It sounded like someone trying to slow Caitlin Clark down. Within hours, sports forums and comment sections were exploding with theories. Some people believed league officials were worried about creating too much attention around a single player. Others thought it might have been pressure from veteran athletes who didn't want the spotlight shifting too heavily toward a rookie. And of course, there were plenty of fans who immediately jumped to the most dramatic conclusion possible: that someone inside the system was intentionally trying to limit her opportunities. At that point, none of those theories were confirmed. The screenshot itself didn't mention Caitlin Clark by name, and there was no official explanation attached to it. But the timing lined up almost perfectly with the Super Bowl invitation that had suddenly vanished weeks earlier. That coincidence alone was enough to push the story into overdrive. Sports commentators started discussing the situation on television. Analysts debated whether the league might be struggling with the sudden explosion of attention surrounding one player. Meanwhile, fans continued to dissect every piece of information they could find, trying to figure out whether the message was connected to the invitation that never happened. And then something even stranger began to surface. People who worked around Super Bowl events started hinting that Caitlin Clark's name had actually appeared on early planning lists for celebrity guests. Those lists are usually flexible and change constantly during the weeks leading up to the event, but the details still added fuel to the growing speculation. If her name really had been included at one point, then the question became unavoidable. Who removed it? The story was beginning to move beyond speculation and into something that felt far more serious. Instead of simply debating marketing strategy, fans were now questioning whether internal decisions had directly affected a player's opportunities. For Caitlin Clark herself, the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. She hadn't originally explained what she meant with her post, but the internet had already started building its own version of the story around those 5 words. They didn't want me there. As the screenshot spread further, the meaning behind that sentence started to look less like a vague comment and more like a direct accusation. And the deeper people looked into the situation, the more it felt like the real answer might not be hidden in the message itself. It might be hidden in something that happened on the night of the Super Bowl, a conversation that took place backstage, completely out of public view, when Caitlin Clark unexpectedly ran into someone who knew exactly why her invitation had disappeared. By the time the Super Bowl actually arrived, most people had already moved on from the mystery surrounding Caitlin Clark's missing invitation. The event itself was enormous, as it always is. Celebrities flooded the stadium, sponsors hosted private parties across the city, and cameras captured every moment of the spectacle. For the public, the focus was simple: the game, the halftime show, and the endless stream of viral moments that always follow. But for Caitlin Clark, the night ended up revealing something she hadn't known before. She hadn't originally planned to be involved in the Super Bowl festivities at all. From the outside, it looked like she simply wasn't attending. No drama, no explanation needed. Just another athlete spending the weekend somewhere else. What nobody realized was that she did end up near the event briefly, and that's where something unexpected happened. At some point during the chaos surrounding halftime preparations, Caitlin crossed paths with someone connected to the performance. The details of that meeting weren't public at first, but people close to the situation later hinted that the conversation caught her completely off guard. The person she spoke to assumed she had been invited. Not casually invited, either. They spoke as if her presence had been part of the plan all along. When she seemed confused, they reportedly asked her why she hadn't shown up earlier during the week. There had been celebrity gatherings, sponsor events, backstage meet and greets, the kind of moments where high-profile athletes usually appear alongside musicians, actors, and influencers. To them, it was strange that she hadn't been there. Caitlin's response was simple. She told them she had never received the invitation. That's when the conversation took an unexpected turn. Instead of acting surprised, the person explained something that instantly changed how she understood the situation. According to them, the invitation had absolutely been requested. In fact, they believed the request had been sent more than once. Her name had come up during planning discussions tied to halftime coverage and celebrity appearances. But each time the request moved through the approval process, the same response came back. She couldn't participate. At first, Caitlin assumed there must have been some kind of misunderstanding. Scheduling mistakes happen all the time with large events like the Super Bowl. Maybe the invitation had simply gotten lost somewhere between agents, sponsors, and league representatives. But the person she was speaking to didn't think that was the case. The wording they had heard was very specific. She wasn't unavailable. She was restricted. That word hung in the air for a moment because it meant something completely different. Unavailable suggests a scheduling conflict. Restricted suggests a decision made by someone with authority. In other words, someone had actively stepped in. And if what they were saying was accurate, that decision hadn't come from the NFL or the sponsors organizing the event. It had come from somewhere else. The realization hit slowly at first. Caitlin had spent months dealing with intense attention from the media, from fans, and from the sports world in general. She was used to speculation and rumors by that point. But this felt different. Because if the invitation truly existed, and if it had been denied before she ever saw it, that meant the opportunity had been taken away before she even had the chance to respond. And the person she was speaking with seemed convinced of exactly that. They told her their team had asked about her presence multiple times while planning the event. Each time they were told the same thing, that she wouldn't be participating in any Super Bowl activities connected to the halftime show. For a moment, Caitlin just stood there processing what she had heard. Until that conversation, she hadn't thought much about the situation. Missing a celebrity event wasn't the end of the world. Athletes skip appearances all the time. But hearing that explanation made the entire story feel completely different. Because now it sounded less like an invitation that never happened, and more like an opportunity that had quietly been shut down. That conversation stayed with her for the rest of the night. And hours later, after the halftime show ended and the internet was celebrating another Super Bowl spectacle, Caitlin Clark picked up her phone and wrote the message that would send the sports world into chaos. "They didn't want me there." At first, Caitlin Clark's post didn't look like the beginning of a sports controversy. It was short, almost cryptic, the kind of message people sometimes share without expecting it to become a headline. But within minutes, the reaction online made it clear that something bigger had just started. Sports fans have a strange ability to sense when there's more to a story than what's written on the screen. The moment people read those 5 words, "They didn't want me there," curiosity kicked in. Screenshots started spreading across social media. Fans began tagging reporters. Comment sections filled with the same question repeating over and over again. Who is they? The message quickly moved beyond her personal followers. Major sports accounts began reposting it, trying to understand what it meant. Within an hour, the post had reached millions of views, and the conversation surrounding the Super Bowl began shifting in a direction nobody expected. Instead of arguing about halftime performances or debating the best plays of the game, people were now trying to decode Caitlin Clark's message. Reporters started contacting sources inside both the WNBA and the NFL, hoping someone could explain the situation. Some early responses were vague. Others claimed there was nothing unusual about the event planning process. But the uncertainty only made fans more suspicious. Because the internet had already begun connecting the dots. The missing invitation. The internal message about limiting individual exposure. The mysterious explanation that she had been restricted. Individually, each detail might have seemed harmless. But together, they created a narrative that was impossible for fans to ignore. Within a few hours, the story had completely taken over sports media. Commentators who had spent the entire evening discussing football were suddenly talking about women's basketball. Debate shows the next morning opened with segments analyzing Caitlin Clark's post instead of breaking down the Super Bowl game itself. The shift was dramatic. Even people who didn't closely follow the WNBA started paying attention, because the situation touched on a much bigger conversation in sports. How leagues promote their stars and how power behind the scenes can influence who gets opportunities. As the discussion intensified, more information began appearing online. Some insiders claimed sponsors had indeed pushed for Caitlin Clark to appear during Super Bowl week. Others hinted that the invitation had moved through several layers of approval before suddenly disappearing. None of those details were officially confirmed, but the consistency of the reports made the situation harder to dismiss. Then a second screenshot began circulating. This one appeared to show part of an internal conversation discussing the importance of maintaining balance when promoting athletes. Again, Caitlin Clark's name wasn't directly mentioned, but the timing of the message made people suspicious. Fans interpreted the language in the most dramatic way possible. To them, it sounded like someone inside the system had decided that Caitlin Clark's popularity was becoming too powerful too quickly. Whether that interpretation was accurate or not didn't matter at that point. Once the idea reached social media, it spread faster than anyone could control. People began debating whether leagues sometimes try to slow down rising stars in order to protect established hierarchies. Others argued that the situation might simply be a misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. But the volume of the discussion kept growing. Every new comment, every new theory, every new screenshot added fuel to the story. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, another rumor began circulating. One that pushed the situation from speculation into something much more explosive. According to several people who claimed to be familiar with the planning process, Caitlin Clark might not have been blocked from just one appearance. She may have been removed from multiple Super Bowl-related events entirely. That claim wasn't confirmed immediately, but the possibility alone changed the entire tone of the conversation. Because if it were true, the story wasn't about a single invitation disappearing. It would mean someone had deliberately made sure she wasn't part of the biggest sports weekend in America. And once that possibility entered the conversation, the internet did what it always does. It started searching for the person responsible. But before anyone could identify a name, another piece of the puzzle appeared. One that suggested the situation inside the league might be far more complicated than anyone outside had realized. As the conversation kept spreading online, something unusual started happening inside the basketball world itself. At first, most players stayed quiet. That's usually how situations like this unfold. Athletes tend to avoid public controversy, especially when the story involves league decisions or internal politics. But the longer the debate continued, the harder it became for people inside the sport to ignore. It started with a few subtle reactions. A like here. A short comment there. Nothing dramatic at first, just small signals that some players were paying very close attention to what Caitlin Clark had said. Fans noticed it immediately. Every social media interaction became another clue people tried to interpret. Then one player posted a message that changed the tone of the entire conversation. She didn't mention Caitlin Clark directly, but the meaning was obvious. Her tweet said that if people knew how many opportunities had been quietly shut down behind the scenes over the years, fans would see the league very differently. That one sentence exploded across sports media. Within minutes, fans were asking the same question again, but this time with even more urgency. What exactly has been happening behind the scenes? Soon after that, another player posted something even more direct. She wrote that sometimes the biggest obstacle in a league isn't competition on the court. It's the people who decide who gets seen and who doesn't. At that point, it became clear that Caitlin Clark's post had opened a door that many athletes had been hesitant to push open themselves. For years, players across multiple sports have talked privately about how exposure works. Who gets marketing opportunities? Who gets featured in promotional campaigns? Who gets invited to major events? Those decisions are often influenced by business strategies that fans never see. Normally, those conversations stay private. But this time, the topic had reached the public. Some players appeared to support Caitlin's message openly. Others remained cautious, choosing not to comment at all. A few even suggested that the situation was being exaggerated by fans who didn't fully understand how professional leagues operate. And that's when the divide became obvious. On one side were players who believed Caitlin Clark's rise represented an opportunity for the entire sport. More viewers meant more attention, more sponsorships, and ultimately more growth for women's basketball. On the other side were voices warning that focusing too heavily on a single athlete could overshadow the contributions of players who had spent years building the league. Both arguments had passionate supporters. But the real tension didn't come from those opinions. It came from something else entirely: the growing belief that someone with real authority might have actively tried to shape the situation. As fans continued digging for information, more rumors started appearing about the internal decisions surrounding the Super Bowl invitation. Some sources claimed that multiple marketing opportunities connected to Caitlin Clark had been redirected to other athletes instead. Others hinted that certain executives had been discussing how to manage her rapid rise more carefully. None of those claims were officially confirmed, but they were enough to keep the conversation alive. Meanwhile, reporters were still trying to identify the source of the screenshots and leaked messages that had started the controversy in the first place. Someone clearly had access to internal discussions, and whoever that person was seemed determined to keep releasing information. That realization added a new layer of mystery to the story. Because if those messages were real, they had to come from somewhere inside the league itself. Which meant one thing: there was likely a whistleblower watching the entire situation unfold from the inside. And whoever that person was, they might know exactly what had happened to Caitlin Clark's missing Super Bowl invitation. Once the idea of a whistleblower entered the conversation, the entire story took on a new level of tension. Up to that point, everything had been built on speculation, screenshots, and the kind of online detective work fans love to do whenever a mystery appears in sports. But the possibility that someone inside the league was deliberately leaking information changed the stakes completely. Because if that was true, then the story wasn't just about Caitlin Clark anymore. It was about what might be happening behind closed doors. Late that evening, another piece of information began circulating online. This time it wasn't a marketing discussion or a vague internal note. It appeared to be part of a longer conversation between league officials discussing how to manage outside requests involving players. One line in particular caught everyone's attention. The message suggested that if certain athletes gained too much visibility too quickly, it could shift sponsorship leverage in ways the league might struggle to control. That sentence alone sent fans into a frenzy. The wording sounded strategic, almost corporate, but people reading it interpreted something very different. To them, it sounded like an admission that someone inside the system was worried about losing control of the spotlight. And if Caitlin Clark was the athlete being discussed, it would explain a lot. By that point, the theory spreading across social media was simple. The league wasn't just reacting to her popularity, it was trying to manage it. Some analysts pushed back against that idea. They argued that internal discussions like this happen in every professional sport. Marketing departments constantly debate how to balance star power with league branding. From a business standpoint, it's not unusual for executives to think carefully about how exposure is distributed. But the timing of everything made the situation feel suspicious. The missing Super Bowl invitation. The backstage conversation revealing she had been restricted. The internal messages about controlling visibility. Put together, it looked less like coincidence and more like a pattern. And that's exactly why the next development sent shockwaves through the sports world. Another account, one that had never posted anything about the league before, suddenly appeared online claiming to have access to additional information. The profile didn't reveal a name, didn't show a photo, and didn't identify where the information was coming from. All it posted was a short message. It claimed that Caitlin Clark wasn't removed from just one Super Bowl appearance. According to that post, she had been taken off multiple guest lists connected to the event. Celebrity meet and greets. Sponsored dinners. Media day appearances. The account suggested that every time her name appeared on an event list, it had been quietly removed before final approval. If the claim was accurate, the implications were massive. Blocking a single appearance might be explained away as scheduling confusion. But removing someone from several events in a row would suggest a deliberate decision made at a much higher level. Fans immediately began debating whether the anonymous account could be trusted. Some believed it was a genuine insider trying to expose something unfair. Others suspected it might be someone exaggerating the situation to create drama. But the most interesting part of the post wasn't the accusation itself. It was the final sentence. The account claimed that someone very close to the internal discussions had been watching the situation unfold for months. Someone who had seen how opportunities were being approved, and how others were being denied. And according to that message, that person had finally decided to speak up. The identity of the insider wasn't revealed. No names were mentioned. But the possibility that a whistleblower existed inside the league made the story far more serious than a simple social media controversy. Because if someone with real access was preparing to expose internal decisions, the fallout could reach far beyond one athlete or one event. It could force the entire sports world to confront how those decisions are actually made. By the next morning, the situation had grown far beyond a single social media post. What started as 5 cryptic words from Caitlin Clark had turned into one of the most talked about sports stories of the week. Television segments were dissecting every detail. Podcasts were releasing emergency episodes. Reporters were chasing sources across multiple organizations trying to confirm what was real and what had simply been amplified by the internet. But inside the league offices, the mood was reportedly very different. Because when stories like this begin spreading that fast, the pressure builds quickly behind the scenes. Executives know that the longer silence continues, the more space there is for speculation to grow. Sponsors start asking questions. Media partners want clarification. And the athletes themselves begin wondering what the truth actually is. At first, the league stayed quiet. No statement. No denial. No confirmation. For several hours, the only voices shaping the conversation were fans, commentators, and the mysterious account that claimed an insider had been leaking information. That silence only made the situation feel more serious. Then finally, a short statement appeared. The league acknowledged that it was aware of the discussion surrounding Caitlin Clark and the Super Bowl invitations. It emphasized that player appearances at external events involve many factors, including scheduling, marketing coordination, and existing partnerships. The message suggested that the situation was being misunderstood and that no single individual had intentionally blocked a player from participating. On paper, the response sounded calm and professional. But online, it didn't calm anyone down. Fans immediately began pointing out that the statement didn't actually address the key questions people had been asking. It didn't explain the backstage conversation Caitlin had described. It didn't mention the internal messages that had been circulating. And it certainly didn't address the possibility that someone inside the system had deliberately removed her from multiple Super Bowl events. Instead, the response felt like something designed to slow the conversation without really answering it. Which, of course, had the opposite effect. The debate exploded again. Some people believed the league was telling the truth and that the entire controversy had grown out of misunderstandings and incomplete information. Others felt the statement sounded carefully worded in a way that avoided addressing the central issue. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark herself remained mostly quiet. That silence became its own kind of statement. She didn't start posting long explanations or arguing with critics online. She simply allowed the discussion to continue while reporters and fans tried to piece together what had happened. But the quiet didn't last forever. Later that day, she posted again. The message was just as short as the first one, but the tone was slightly different. Instead of raising questions, it suggested that the story might not be finished yet. She wrote that sometimes the truth takes time to come out, but it always finds a way. That sentence sent the internet right back into detective mode. Because if Caitlin Clark believed more information would eventually surface, then the possibility of an insider leak suddenly seemed much more realistic. And if someone inside the league truly had access to the conversations that led to her missing Super Bowl appearance, it meant one thing was almost certain. The biggest revelation in the story might not have happened yet.